Cool.
So now, criteria. So you've all seen in the docs the page about element criteria model. You probably don't. I mean, I don't expect normal people to really understand it, and that's total laziness on our part to just throw that out there and not really take the time to fully explain how it all works. But element criteria models are basically just models. So they're storing key value pairs, but they're used to find elements of a given type. So basically, the key value pairs that they're defining, rather than mapping back to attributes on a record. So, for example, in my calendar model, where the attributes are, ID and name and handle and field layout ID, and those are all things that are meant to be saved. Element criteria models, the key value pairs that you're storing on those are used to find elements that match that criteria. So if you take a look at element criteria model in the system, you'll see that in its constructor, like any other model, you can start by passing in an array of attributes, and those attributes will be automatically assigned to the model. But it also has the second required parameter called element type, and this is basically the string telling it what type of element we're going to be trying to fetch here. And the reason that we need to set the element type when we're creating an element criteria model is because, in this case, while there is this array of default attributes that you can search for, every element type is given a chance to add additional criteria attributes. So, in entries case, we're saying that if you're looking for entries, if you're doing a craft.entries, we're also going to support you being able to set an after attribute, author group ID, author ID, etc. So this function is basically our chance to say, here's the non-standard attributes that you're allowed to include in your craft.events or whatever function that we're going to support and that you'll be able to set without a PHP error getting thrown. So if you take a look at back at element criteria model, you'll see there's this giant list of attributes that every element supports, and then it says mix in any custom attributes defined by the element type. So it actually says element type attributes equals this element type.defineCriteriaAttributes. This is where that function gets called, and then it says attributes equals array merge attributes, and then element type attributes. And then finally, it also mixes in any custom fields. So this is where we add support for searching against specific custom field values and stuff like that. But this is the part that we're actually concerned with. So you take a look back at this event element type. We've got defined criteria attributes, and we're adding support for a calendar attribute, calendar ID, start date, and end date. And order is something that was already in this default list somewhere, order. And the default value for that was that it would order by date created in a descending order. And the reason that we're also defining order in our element type is because we want to tweak the default value. So rather than ordering by date created descending, we want to order by start date ascending. So that if we have multiple events, they are going to be in order up by their start date from nearest event to furthest event.
Can I maybe jump in while Brandon's on mute? Oh, I'm seeing myself. That's terrible. But yeah, I'm not sure if Brandon can hear me, but I think I speak for everyone when I say that that went beyond our wildest dreams. But I was playing with this today, and what was a great realization for me was that an element type isn't this massive thing that you have to set up. It's actually this kind of, or the way I saw it was this extra layer that you put on top of your plugin. And there's literally two things that you need to add. There's the element type file, which he was just showing us there, and then you just need to have a model that extends BaseElementModel as opposed to base model. And once you have those two things in place, then you basically go through your element type and you just populate those methods. So has content, has statuses, get sources, and those things usually will reference your plugin's service. But you just kind of add that layer of element type on top of your plugin by populating those methods. And really then everything that we just saw now becomes available to you. So the modal window, filtering by sources, searching, reordering the table, having table view and the other view, all those things just kind of become automatically available. So what we saw also with the calendar and the custom layout, you don't even need to use that. So I have this kind of experimental plugin that I'm working with. It stores its content in its own table, so I don't need those custom fields, but I get all the benefits that we just saw. And it's literally two files with, I think my element type file, yeah, it's 170 lines of code, most of which I copied from the user element type or something like that. So I think that the barrier to entry is very small, because you just got to make sure that that the base element type can grab what it needs to populate your page, and then maybe I'll share my screen. Well, no, I won't share my screen now because we're on the record. But outputting it in a template as well, and I'm sure Brandon will show this. You just need to extend the element index template, which is in the layouts folder, and you just say which element type, and then so I have literally 3 lines of code in my template, and I get that whole screen where you can filter by sources and see everything in your table view. So I see element types as being kind of a layer that you can add on top of your plugin, and if you want to get into kind of more depth, then you can start adding your custom fields as well. I don't know, Brandon, do you agree with that? Or
yeah, I think that's kind of what I was trying to get at when I was calling it a veneer on top of your application. You're still approaching your application the same way that you would without Element Type API. But once you've got it in place, adding this veneer of element type stuff on top is basically gets all of your code to interface with the rest of Craft and take advantage of a lot of things Craft has to offer. Without a whole lot of work. So, I mean, the goal here is that the actual element type stuff is not a lot of work. That it's mainly just about adding these functions like I've been showing you that tell the system a little bit about your plugin, a little bit about your element type.
And I believe whether you choose to use the Craft content table or not is really up to you.
Yeah, so you mean like as far as the index is concerned?
No, well, how you want to store your content, you can store it in your own.
Yeah. Okay, the content database table. For that, it basically comes down to whether you say that your element type has content or not. And if you don't care about custom fields, if you don't care about the content table, then you just say that yours doesn't have content. You actually, and I don't know, maybe this is what you're referring to as well. You have the control in this API to give your element type a custom content table if you wanted. So matrix, for example, each matrix field has its own content table. I don't see many things besides matrix really needing that feature. I think most of the time you want to share the same set of fields that everything else shares, but in the event that you have a use case where you absolutely need your own set of fields and you need your own content table, you also have that power with the ElementType API.
And just to clarify, when you say content, we're referring specifically to custom field content.
Custom fields, yep.
I think it might be beneficial for everyone if you don't mind, Brandon, quickly bringing up the Craft content table, because I think that's really good to see what's stored in there. And maybe you could show what was saved in your... so, do you have another table for your events?
Yes.
So if you could show how that's related, I think that might be really helpful for everyone to see.
So events is what I was kind of talking about earlier, called our element extension table. In that it's a normal table, it's got an ID, calendar ID, start date, end date, and then the audit columns, date created, date updated, and UID that automatically get added. The one thing that's unique about it is if you look at the relations, the events.id column is actually a foreign key to the craft.elements table. And so elements, every element in the system is going to get a row in this table. And so basically the idea is that any element in the system is going to have its own unique ID, and it gets its unique ID from this table. So you'll find that there's not a whole lot going on here. It's basically just what's the ID, what type of element is this, is it enabled, is it archived, and then the standard audit columns. That's it. Everything else is either going to be saved. It's either going to be saved in the content table, the elements I18N table, or your element types extension table, such as this craft_events table. So going back to the standard ones, we've got this elements I18N, and this stores anything that might be localized with your elements. So all the data in here, there's an ID, there's an element ID foreign key back to the elements.id column. There's a locale column which says which locale we're talking about here. And then there's slug, URI, and then whether that element is enabled for that locale. Now, if your element type is not localized, and I don't want to get into that today because that's just, one thing at a time, I guess, but if your element type is localized, then you're gonna this table is gonna kind of come alive for you. But even if it's not, every element also needs at least one row in this table. It's non-negotiable, just because we found that the SQL queries are going to be a little faster if we can just be sure that there's going to be this row here. But you don't need to worry. You don't need to worry about either of these tables, and I'll get to why later. But the elements table, the elements I18N table, and then the content table. And the content table is where your titles get stored, and all of your custom field values, again on a per locale basis, just like the elements I18N table. All three of these tables are things that you don't ever need to worry about with your element as of Craft 2.0. As of Craft 2.0, all of this stuff is totally abstracted away, and we'll get into that in a little bit.
So Brandon, can you quickly just search for peers, and then we can see in that table, and then we can see that we'll see that field_body should be populated.
Right.
Yeah. So that's where the content, as we were talking about content earlier, is stored. It's the custom field content, and that's stored in the content table if you choose to use it.
As opposed to the start and end dates, which aren't content, they are specific event attributes. They are things that they're the things that define what an event is.
Right.
In the same way that an author ID is part of what defines what an entry is, as opposed to an event. Events don't have an author, so there's no need for an event to have an author. An entry, 99% of the time, does need to have an author. So, the concept of an author in Craft is unique to the entry element type. It's not a central element type concept.
Right. The difference here being that the body was a custom field, whereas
Right.
start date and end date are they're not optional.
Right. So
Hey, Brandon, sorry to interrupt. I'm noticing that your tables are craft_events and craft_events calendars. Is the plugin name supposed to be in there somewhere, or how does this? Are you worried about conflicts in the future?
it's just it's a convention thing. We're not going to worry about it. I think that it's a best practice that your tables should always start with your plugin name.
Mm.
Can help it, and that'll help and get conflicts. But beyond that, we're not. And so that's more of something that like we're going to pay attention to when you submit a plugin to the store. When we launch that, like that's the kind of thing that's going to be on our checklist. Let's make sure that any tables this plugin is adding aren't gonna, are sort of namespace based on the plugin.
Right. Okay. So this is just a demo.
This is well. In this case, I'm following the convention. The plugin name is called events, and so the table is events and events underscore.
Oh, because the plugin name is events.
Right.
Okay, I gotcha. Okay, copy that.
And on this note, events is probably not something that we would allow in the plugin store. This is totally a big
generic
right here. But one of the big guidelines that we're probably going to put in place is that you should avoid overly generic words. And the reason for that is that basically our rule of thumb is going to be, is this something that if we were to add the feature natively into Craft, is this the type of word that we would use to describe it? And if so, just to avoid future conflicts, we would probably, like events, if Craft ever had an event service, I don't even know what it would do, but if it ever had an event service for whatever reason, it would be called events. So so this is, again, I'm not following these supposed guidelines down the road, but something to keep in mind.
It could be that Lindsay got a bit confused there because your table name is craft_events as opposed to craft_events.
And he was expecting, yeah.
Yeah, it kind of didn't occur to me that events was the name of your plugin, but knowing that, it does make sense.
Right. So
Cool.
I mean,
Thank you.
that'd be another. Yeah, I should have taken a second. I was just running against the clock, so I didn't.
No worries.
Think
No
of
worries.
PT events or whatever, but okay. So let's get back to this real quick and try and get through the rest of this element type class so we can move on to bigger and better things.
Yes.
To define criteria attributes, we went over that. This is basically just an array that gets merged into the attributes array on the element model. It makes it so that these things are things that can be set when you're searching for events, in this case. This function up next, modifyElementsQuery. This is where we actually look for these attributes and we actually do something with them. So you'll notice there's a separation here. It's this array is just saying these are the attributes that we support, and then in the context of an actual query, this is where we actually look at those values and try and modify the database query to take those values into account. So modifyElementsQuery, this is a function that gets called in the element service. Let's see, gets called twice, once for field types and then once for the actual element type. So we're concerned with the second one here. This is basically this function happens in a function called buildElementsQuery in the element service. And this buildElementsQuery function is basically just creating a giant MySQL query to try and find elements based on a bunch of stuff in that element criteria model that was passed in. So you see, I'm sorry, I went a little too far up. BuildElementsQuery, it receives a criteria argument, and then this other stuff you don't need to worry about. It normalizes it on element criteria model. It gets your element type instance, and then it just starts going down the list. If your element type is localized, then it starts starts enforcing the locale on the criteria model. I'm sorry, if it's not localized, then it forces the locale to be the primary site locale. So this is basically when I said that even if your element type is not localized, all contents can be stored on a per locale basis, it's basically going to get the primary site locale by default. And there's even some code in place so that if the primary site locale changes, for example, if you go into your locales page and drag the second locale up to the top position, there's actually some code in place. I think it's no, it's not. Where it'll look for all non-localized element types, and for every single one that it can find, it actually goes through and updates all of its data so that it's now using the new primary site locale ID. So you don't need to worry about that kind of thing. But anyways, so if it's not localized, then make sure that we're searching for content on the primary site locale. If it is localized, then make sure that the locale has been set. If it hasn't, set it to the current application locale. And then we start setting up the queries. So you can see we're grabbing the elements.id, elements.type, all this stuff from the elements table. We're also grabbing some stuff from the elements I to N table for every single elements query, from the elements table with an alias of elements, from joining in the elements I to N table with an alias of elements I to N, where the locale matches up, and make sure that this could actually go away. Probably save some time or remove this line. So then if the element type has content, then we start, we join in the content table, we add a bunch of selects and wheres and stuff for that, and start going down the list of supported criteria attributes. ID is supported, archive is supported, there's central, we figure out, the status, if a status was set. Your element type does have the ability to provide custom status support. So, for example, if you search for entries with the status of live, the code that allows live to be a supported status that has meaning happens right here. Date created, date updated. Slug and URIs are central things as of Craft 2.0, so it handles searching for those. It searches, factors in the related to parameter if you're looking for elements that are related to something else. There's a whole other class, element relation param parser, that handles all that crap because there's just a lot of different variables there, a lot of different syntaxes that parameter supports. And then goes ahead and if the element type has content, we're grabbing content, then we actually get the field layout and give each field in the field, or I'm sorry, we don't worry about the field layout here. We actually go through every single field in the system and give the field types a chance to modify the elements query if they want to. And then finally, we call your element types modifyElementsQuery function. We pass in the query, pass in the element criteria model that we've got, and you have two choices in this function. You can either just modify the query and move on, or if there's something you find in the they're not going to find any results, then you can also just return false. And so you can see we're checking for false, and if the element type returns false with this function, then we just immediately abort because the element type has made it known that there's not going to be any results here. Finally, we move on to factoring in structured parameters, and that's also a central element type concept as of Craft 2, the concept of structures and structured elements, but we're not going to get into that today. So anyways, back to events. You can see that in our function, we're basically checking. The first thing we're doing is we're joining in our events table. So we're saying join in the events table on events.id equals elements.id. We're adding the calendar ID, the start date, and the end date to our selects. And then we're going through our list of custom criteria attributes that we defined earlier. We're checking to see if they've actually requested a specific calendar ID, and if so, we're we're calling this query.andWhere. And there's a helper function. There's a helper class called dbHelper, which has a function called parseParam. And you could basically pass in the column that you want to be searching against, the value, and then the array of parameters that should get appended to if it wants to. So basically, this this function, if you ever want to take a look at it, dbHelper parseParam, this is what adds support for like the not prefix, the less than, equal than stuff, all that kind of thing, and it turns it into like a valid SQL query, or valid SQL conditional anyway. So so we call that all the time in these modifyElementsQuery functions. So just kind of saves us a lot of code. If they've specified the calendar param, well, that's supposed to be a calendar handle. So in that case, we're going to join in the calendars table as well, and then we're going to create a condition on the calendars table for the calendars.handle. And then there's also another function called parseDateParam, which just has a couple more special case things for specifically times where we're dealing with dates. So we're passing start and end dates into this dbHelper parseDateParam function against the entries.startDate and entries.endDate columns. So that's all we're doing here. So it's basically just mapping the different criteria attributes that we've decided to support to database columns. That's essentially what's going on here. Does that make sense?
Yep.
So just to tie that all together, if we go up to the top, this get sources, you can see that we've said for each calendar we want to add a new source where the label is the calendar name and the criteria is calendar ID equals calendar.id. So the reason this is possible is because calendar ID is something we've specifically said we support in defineCriteriaAttributes. So that means when I click on conferences right here, there's an element criteria model being created in the back end, which has this calendar ID set to the conference's calendar ID. And then when it gets around to actually looking for elements, it gets down to modifyElementsQuery. Calendar ID is set, so that gets added to the where, and then Piers ends up getting returned because that was in the conference's the calendar ID matched up for that one. So that's how all that works. One last thing. What's that?
Cool.
So just to clarify, that modifyElementsQuery is optional. Like if you don't touch that, then it's going to return what's in the content table. Right.
So it's basically that's your chance to if you and this is all optional. Everything that I've gone over today, every single function is optional. If you look at BaseElementType, there's already default values for all these different things, and you can take as much of this as you want based on what your element type actually needs. In this case, and I think this is a pretty typical case, there are a couple custom criteria attributes that we want to support, and so we had to have these two functions where we A, define which criteria attributes we want to support that are custom, and B, we actually apply those values to the query in the event that they're filled in.
Right, and this is, I think, what is the beauty of the base element type class, that actually everything already exists, and you can optionally just overwrite the parts that you need.
Right, and you know what? There's a ton of stuff that is in there that we're not even going over today because it's just not relevant to this element type. The main thing I'm just trying to do is give you a sense for how this particular element type would be able to exist with the APIs given. I think it would take a couple days to go for every possibility you have at your fingertips. But I mean, the code's all there. It's all pretty clean. Take a look at BaseElementType and just scroll through there, and you should get a pretty good sense of what's there. And we can help you if there's any questions. And of course, at some point, we will be documenting all of it. Hopefully, shortly after Piers. So
I have one question or comment, I guess, about the previous method or this method right here, that modifyElementsQuery. I think that even though it's optional, it's probably one of the ones that, because I've been working on an actual events plugin myself for booking purposes, and even though the modifyElementsQuery is optional, like you said, I think it's a very common use case to be
oh
able to
yeah,
modify some of the values. So I think it's awesome that you went through it in its entirety, because it just kind of let us know this is
yeah. The
what we're
reason that
doing. And
the reason that I chose events here is because I think that what I'm going over, most of the element types are going to be using these specific functions.
mhm.
So there's a lot more that I'm
Right.
not covering that are more fringe features that not every element type is going to need. Although I will say, out of the 7 or 8 element types that Craft has, every feature that the Element Type API has, we have a need for somewhere. So I shouldn't, who knows? Who knows how it'll all work out? But yes, modifyElementsQuery is probably going to be used by pretty much everyone. I
Mhm.
mean, you could envision actually, okay, I think globals, for example, don't have a modifyElementsQuery because it's just anytime that we're grabbing globals, we're grabbing them all. So there's just no need for any custom criteria there. Um, and I guess you could envision an element type that is just the most basic possible wrapper for content in the world that doesn't have any custom attributes or anything. It's just, someone wanted like the most lightweight entry they could think of, so they created one, and who knows? And maybe that one doesn't modify. I don't know. But
Brandon, I
anyways, okay.
wonder if you could
Go back
show
to,
us one of the odd ones so we have some idea what you're talking about in terms of things you wouldn't use a lot, but some idea of the scope and span of what you got there.
yeah.
Did I do that right? Did you hear my question?
I'm sorry, you kind of cut out there. Is it just my internet, or is it?
No, I can't hear him either. But I think what he was saying is that he was asking for you to show one of those odd ones that you don't see being used as often as the ones you're showing us. But if you have to go through, if you have
We can,
something else to go over, and then we can visit an
you
odd
know what?
one.
We can take a
Um,
real quick look at base element type, and I'll just pull out a couple. Um,
okay.
is localized again, like if you're doing anything with, I mean, realistically, most element types are going to want to be localized. Craft only has one that doesn't use localization, and that's users. And that's
Users.
because the content that's associated with users tends to be like profile data, and I can't imagine a user filling in their profile and then wanting to like take the time to translate it.
Mm.
So users aren't localized. See, I'm not going to go into statuses right now. Define searchable attributes. We didn't go over this, but if you have some attributes that that you think people might want to use as keywords for your when searching for your elements, then you could throw those attributes in here. I'm trying to think. Like tags, for example. Tags don't have titles; they have names. And the reason and the distinction between a title and a name in Craft is that titles are translatable, names are not. So you'll notice like there's sections have names, user groups have names, tag groups have names, category groups have names, tags have names, whereas entries have titles. Categories have titles. And the distinction there is that like titles are things that you would want to store on a per locale basis if you're doing a multilingual site. Tags are kind of a gray area, I guess. But we just kind of figured, okay, well, we think of a tag as like a static string, not something that you would change on a per locale basis. It's something you'd want to search using, or use it as just a search keyword thing on its own without ever actually outputting them. So we just felt like tags didn't really need to be localized as much as categories would, for example. So tags have names. So if you were to look at tag field type, it would have something like this in it. Define searchable attributes and just returning an array with the word name in it. And that tells the search service when it's indexing a new tag to include the name value in its indexes, so that when you're tags, you can do name colon tag name, whatever. So that's a function that we're not going over. GetIndexHtml, this is a new one for 2.0. This, and we haven't gotten into element indexes yet, so we're jumping ahead of the gun here a little bit, but getIndexHtml gives your element type a chance to completely customize everything that happens on the right side of this page, or not the whole right side, everything underneath the search on this page. So categories, for example, is taking advantage of this. We're overriding that function, and that gives us the opportunity to add a category thing right here, which is a category-specific feature. Because categories, we didn't want to have a whole page dedicated to creating each category, because there are things that people tend to add quickly, rapid fire category addition. So we figured the UI needed to cater to that use case, that scenario. So in categories example, we override getIndexHtml and we give it a custom index. What else we got?
Very helpful.
Yeah,
that kind of really gets at it.
Okay. Yeah, there's all kinds of crazy stuff in here. And if you ever run into a need, if you're writing an element type and you feel like you need to be able to do something and the API doesn't have the function for it yet, just get in touch. Every time we've added an element type, we've had a need for a new function somewhere. So modularity to it. So just let us know, and we'll see what we can do about getting additional functions in. I'm sure for a while, new element types are going to have random new needs that we're going to need to cater to. That's no big deal. So just let us know. So anyways, okay, so getting back to element service, this function, buildElementsQuery, right here. This function is actually called a few different places in this class. Because it's not always the case that we're going to want to select all this data and we're just going to want to output the elements that result out of it. For example, if you're just looking for the total number of elements that match a criteria, you can see we start off by doing query equals this get buildElementsQuery, and then from there, if it didn't return false, then rather than actually executing the query by its own, we pass it into this getElementIDs from query function, and return the count of the total of that. And I think that there's like that might be it actually. It might just be getTotalElements and then getElements, but findElements. But anyway, so findElements. This is the function that gets called when you treat your element criteria model as an array. So, for example, in your template, if you were to do craft or entry in craft.entries, craft.entries is actually a function. Being treated like an array, and so what happens behind the scenes is it actually passes it on to find. So element criteria model has this find function, which used to be the only way to actually get this stuff. You used to not be able to treat it like an array. And find basically is a wrapper for this craft.elements.findElements function. So craft.entries versus craft.entries.find both do the same thing. And find maps to this findElements function. Takes a criteria argument, and in the event of certain other functions within element criteria model, we might pass just ID equals true. You don't really need to worry about that. You won't ever probably be interfacing with findElements directly. Usually, you'll just be interfacing with element criteria models. But anyway, so findElements calls buildElementsQuery, and then applies any search parameters it wants, blah, blah, blah. And then applies offset, applies limit. Finally, it actually calls query all. It gets all the rows, gets all the results. And then it goes through and it creates an array Let's start. Oh, sorry.
Yeah, I think a penny dropped back there. I think that we don't have to use find anymore in Twig code because of this alteration, this alternative method that you got in there.
Yeah, as of that's actually been the case since I think 1.2 or 1.3, probably
Okay.
1.3. Find is just automatically called if you don't call it yourself.
Great.
And the reason we did that was because if you ever do, for example, something like entry dot descendants, if it's a structure section. So originally that would have returned an array of the actual found elements, but then like we started getting support where people wanted to add additional criteria on there. So entry.descendants.type equals news or whatever. And so the only way to like add support for additional parameters before you actually start looping through it without breaking everyone that was already doing something like that would be to add this whole auto magic, if it's treated like an array, then make it an array kind of thing. So at that point, as soon as you treat it like an array, it calls find on its own.
Absolutely, makes excellent sense.
Yeah. So anyways, so elements, the whole point of findElements is to populate this elements array and then return it. And so it starts by actually getting the results. We saw that. And then one at a time, it appends them. It appends actual elements. And so so at what point does this array of database, like static database results, turn into an actual element? And the answer to that is your element type's populateElementModel function. So this function on your element type is responsible for taking a static array of data that came from the database and turning it into an actual element model. So if we take a look at populateElementModel on my events element type, you'll see it's very simple. It takes in a row, and all it does is say return event model, populate model, and then passes in row. That's it. That's all this function has to do. It's one line. It takes an array and it populates an event model and returns the event model. So this function is basically like where Craft ever finds out that you're using this particular model class to represent your elements. So this is a very crucial function. You could not write an element type without this function, populate element model. And it's very simple. GetEditorHtml, I don't have an example, but I didn't get that far in my code, so I'm not going to show that to you guys. But basically, getEditorHtml is your opportunity to customize what shows up when you double-click on one of your elements. So in this case, there's not a whole lot going on. That would be where you would do that, is getEditorHtml. And by default, I think that like the title will get added, the title field, and any custom fields will get added. So that's your element type class in a nutshell. It's basically, you can see it's basically your opportunity to tell the system about your element types, about what features they're going to support, what criteria they're going to support, and then crucially, it's their opportunity to actually create your element models based on database results.